Who do you have? Was it a class assignment or?
Yeah.
Well, we know you can have it. Good point, right?
Yeah, thank you. It is my opportunity as the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University to welcome all of our guests, to welcome those present. This is going to be an exciting day, and I would invite our panelists to come forward because we are going to get started at 8:15 to give them ample time to be able to give their remarks and then have some comments and some questions. All it took was pushing the right button. But what I didn't want to do was push the wrong button and cause someone to lose their PowerPoint. The purpose of the Center for Constitutional Studies is to increase constitutional literacy. I left a secure position at Arizona State Law School to come here. I also took a very significant cut in pay because of this mission. The most important thing in my view, the most important thing in my life is be my grandchildren. And I dread the prospect of their growing up in a world, in a nation that was built on this wonderful foundation and knowing so little of it. So our purpose is constitutional literacy. We are nonpartisan. We bring in all viewpoints, as you'll see today, as you'll see in this panel. And with that, I'm actually going to turn the time over to our panel. We have Andrew Bibby, we have Henry Clark and Joseph Pastel, and they are going to talk about free markets, society, and the law. I will return, if necessary, to help with their comments and questions, but we want to get right to the heart of the matter. We turn it over to the panel. I don't know if you're starting, Andy. I don't know what order.
Clark
Okay. Very good. Professor Clark.
Can you all hear me? Thank you very much for coming. Since I don't think this microphone is working, I think I'll just sort of speak in a more comfortable way, if you don't mind. It's great to be in Utah. Thank you for having me to this event. This panel is about free markets, and I thought what I might do is to just offer a very few general remarks about sort of the world history of markets so that we can understand what the notion of a free market actually is. And I thought maybe the best way forward would be to ask you to think about three possible general categories of markets. And I'm not going to proceed chronologically. Thank you. I'm not going to proceed chronologically, but instead thematically, starting at the bottom of what we might think of as engagement with markets and moving to the top. So the first of my three categories would be the sort of anti-market approach to markets, the non-market markets, if you will, that began 99 years and 11 months ago this month with the Bolshevik Revolution, whose centenary will be marked next month. The regimes that grew out of that revolution have all been dedicated to the proposition that private trading is ultimately suspect, if not flat out evil. And so, when Lenin first came to power, he and many of his fellow revolutionaries were committed to abolishing private trading and replacing it with a system of society-wide sharing. It involved requisition of agricultural goods, and allocation, distribution to consumers in the city rather than the use of a market allocation system. After 3.5 years or so of a really serious experiment with life without markets, Lenin felt it necessary to pull back. There had been famine, there had been civil war, there had been what historians call war communism, which basically involved confiscating agricultural goods from the peasantry and redistributing them to the urban consumers. And the result was simply devastation. And Lenin therefore pulled back, much to the consternation of some of the really ardent revolutionaries among him, and instituted something called the New Economic Policy. Now, the New Economic Policy was little more, there are obviously complications, but it was little more, really, than an allowance, a kind of pragmatic allowance of some degree of market activity. And for the last 99 years and 11 months, all revolutionary socialist regimes, from Lenin's Russia to North Korea to the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela today, has seen a kind of constant tug of war between two forces. One, an ardent, principled opposition to private trading and markets. And two, a pragmatic realization that in fact it's exceedingly difficult to provide for the people without some measure of private trading. If we were to ask ourselves, why is it that the Soviet Union was able to even last for 74 years, I think that historians are slowly coming around to the view that an overlooked answer to that question is they survived because of the illegal markets. Every single regime has in fact allowed, through a wink and a nod in many cases, for illegal black markets, gray markets, informal markets to coexist with a constitutional order. Since this is Constitution Week here in Utah, as it is throughout the United States, I'll emphasize, if you look through the constitutions of each of these revolutionary socialist regimes, what you will find is a hostility to private trading, often an allowance of small-scale trading for peasants and artisans in principle, although in practice, the principles of the regime are opposed even to this, so even these may be regarded as a kind of pragmatic concession to the desires of ordinary people. But in any case, in each and every case, what we find is that over time, it's the emergence of private, black markets, gray markets, illegal markets in the interstices of the regime that have allowed the regime to last as long as it did. We've learned, for example, in recent years that in China, towards the end of the Maoist era, there was a point in the late 60s and early 70s, in the very midst of the Cultural Revolution, when ordinary people increasingly simply stopped obeying the laws on collective agriculture and started engaging in private trading on their own. And more local officials simply began to look the other way and to allow unconstitutional conduct on the part of ordinary people, because those ordinary people themselves had lived through the Great Famine of the 1950s and the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and had decided amongst themselves that private trading was absolutely indispensable to their own survival. And increasingly, they found local government officials who would agree with them. Likewise, in the 1990s, with the devastating famine in North Korea, the regime there appears to have made the decision, who knows really, because there's very little direct evidence that we have on the thinking of the leaders in that country, but they appear to have made the decision that we simply cannot provision the people if we are true to our revolutionary socialist principles. And so you had the emergence of the so-called Jangmadang generation in North Korea, which has gotten so much traction in recent years that some estimates are that as many as 40% of the North Korean people today participate in markets that are illegal, they are unconstitutional, but they are increasingly accepted by the regime as a necessity for their own survival. I think maybe the best way of thinking about this would be to say that markets seem, the lesson of the last 100 years seems to be that markets seem to be a kind of antibody that societies produce in order to fight off the alien pathogen of an ideal of a shared economy without markets. In other words, that markets themselves seem to be, in some fundamental way, natural to the human species. I begin my remarks with this example primarily to underscore the fact that when we talk about the third of my three categories, namely what we call free markets, we must understand that those who devised or invented or discovered or created the ideas behind free markets, Adam Smith, Turgot, the great Enlightenment figures of the 18th century, were not responding to the example of revolutionary socialism. In fact, I often wonder when I teach my seminar on Adam Smith, what Adam Smith would have made of something like war communism under Lenin in 1918 to 1921. My guess is that the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century would have been simply aghast that anyone could have imagined that you could organize whole societies without markets. And the reason for that brings me to the second category of markets that I'd like to bring to your attention, and that is pre-modern, traditional markets of a sort that did exist in the 18th century, that did exist in Adam Smith's time, and that had existed in one form or another for thousands of years. Every civilization that we know of just about, from the ancient Mesopotamians, the old Assyrian Empire of 4,000 years ago with the Kanesh traders that we've learned so much about in recent decades, the Aztec Pozteca traders in old Mexico, to say nothing of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. All of them had markets. All of them had merchants, traders, buyers, and sellers, and it was that world in general that Adam Smith was responding to. Now, Karl Polanyi wrote a book called The Great Transformation, in which he romanticizes these early pre-modern sorts of markets in two ways. One, he argues that yes, markets have been around forever, but you didn't have the kind of restless desire for profits. You didn't have a great deal of profit-oriented activity among the merchants of these traditional pre-modern markets that we have today. And secondly, he argued that these pre-modern markets were embedded in the larger structures of society, state, and culture. And when you see that word embed, if you Google embedded markets, you will be introduced into a large world of rather warm and fuzzy scholarship about how markets actually functioned before the Industrial Revolution came along and disrupted them. Markets were, you get the sense that there was a harmony there between markets and society that does not exist today, according to Polanyi, because markets today have run roughshod over every aspect of human life. I think that it's become increasingly clear that these two propositions of Polanyi are mistaken. I think it's quite clear that there was profit-making activity in all the old markets, in all the old market activity going back at least 4,000 years as far as we know, and probably beforehand. And secondly, when we talk about embedded markets, we need to remember what that embedding actually involved. The markets of the old world, the pre-industrial world, yes, they were embedded, but they were embedded primarily by and for the interests of political authorities and social elites. They were controlled for fiscal purposes. Merchants were used as spies by rulers. I'll give you one small example of what an embedded market was actually like in practice. Merchants were stigmatized in virtually every traditional society as greedy profit makers who, at best, had to be accepted and tolerated, and usually barely so. So one example that occurs to me comes from Aztec Mexico, where the Posteca merchants, who sought social status, of course, as all people do at all times and places, they would capture slaves and then have them ritually impaled and burned before a whole crowd of noble warriors in order to impress the warriors into affording marks of status and dignity to themselves, the Posteca merchants. That's just one small example of what an embedded market actually looked like in practice. Now, by the time that Adam Smith and Turgot came along in the 18th century and invented what we think of as free markets, the traditional markets were in some ways looking pretty modern, in the sense that you had governments that were actually encouraging trade. You had mercantilism in many European countries. That is to say, you had government policy that encouraged export industries and the manufacture and sale of luxury goods abroad and so forth. But you still had embedded markets. And let me just say a word or two about perhaps the most emblematic writing on the whole subject of traditional markets in the 18th century. It's a short article that Turgot wrote, and he was the Controller General in France under the monarchy, and he titled his article, Fairs and Markets. And basically what he argued was that these fairs and markets should be, that all of the privileges, all of the fiscal privileges, as well as the obstacles and impediments and legal restraints upon them should be totally abolished. And the way you do that is you get rid of the privileged markets and you allow people to freely enter into exchange relationships, buying and selling on their own instead. And the reason that he did that was because, in fact, as we now know, those fairs and markets, as he called them, were highly, they were embedded in all kinds of different ways. They were owned, for one thing, very often by aristocratic landlords, who enjoyed special privileges. They were located in places that were more convenient for the lords, for ordinary peasants or ordinary craftsmen or ordinary merchants who often had to go long distances to participate in them. In all kinds of ways, they inhibited the actions of ordinary people who wanted to buy and sell. So when Adam Smith and Turgot developed the idea of a free market, and it became a part of the constitutional order in first the United States, with the United States Constitution, the Commerce Clause, and so forth, and the French Constitution that emerged out of the Revolution of 1789, which abolished the guilds, among other things. These measures were, and this is something that's often forgotten, so let me underscore it. When the Revolutionary Socialists first came to power in 1917, they did so in the name of the poor, the excluded, the working class, the peasantry. We know how that worked out. For Adam Smith and Turgot, and the defenders of the free market have very often been dismissed simply as apologists of the bourgeoisie, apologists of the merchant class, apologists of capitalism and the capitalists. But in fact, their arguments for free markets were precisely designed to curtail the privileges of the wealthy, the privileges, the well-connected, and to open markets up to the very people who were generally discriminated against under the old market systems, the old guild systems, for example. And that would include women, Jews, outsiders, foreigners, those who were not well connected, those who had a new product, a different way of looking at things, a different way of producing things. In short, everyone who didn't have the connections to play the game according to the rules of the embedded markets were now able to participate more actively and productively in a free market. And economic historians have made it very clear in recent years that when the guilds were abolished, these excluded groups were able within a generation to participate much more effectively, much more prosperously in the economic lives of their countries, in places like Holland, for example, and in France. And in England, the guilds had been abolished already beforehand than was the case before. So my final thought, I was asked to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and I've already done so. It's probably seemed like 15 or 20 hours to some of you, but that's all right. I'm about to finish. Would simply be this. The idea of a free market did not arise in response to the revolutionary socialist war against markets that you and I are mostly familiar with. So when we see Adam Smith, he is not responding to Lenin, he is not responding to Marx, he is responding to the crazy quilt, ambiguous, highly litigious markets that existed in 18th century Europe. But B, it's remarkable how applicable those ideas that Turgot and Adam Smith and others had are to the circumstances that we find ourselves in today in 2017. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, and first let me say I could listen to you for 15 hours, Henry Clark, so thank you for your presentation. Let me also thank the organizers of the event today, and I in particular want to thank the Wood Assistants for everything they've done. The Wood Assistants are the lifeblood of the Center for Constitutional Studies, and I think increasingly the lifeblood of UVU's academic mission of academic seriousness. I also want to say thank you for coming so early in the morning. I, in fact, like speaking this early, and one reason is because I can say almost anything and you won't remember what I say. So, let me start with one question. Would you say that your opinion of capitalism is A, very favorable, B, mostly favorable, C, mostly unfavorable, or D, very unfavorable? Would you say your opinion of socialism is A, very favorable, B, mostly favorable, C, mostly unfavorable, or D, very unfavorable. So the reason why I start with this question is that there was a series of studies and a poll in 2015 asking Americans to rate their favorability towards capitalism. 58%, it turns out, have a negative view of socialism. 38% had a negative view of capitalism. This in itself was not surprising, except for one very important part. And here's the quote that sent waves of excitement, alarm, and shock across the media. Among college-aged Americans, 58% report a positive view of socialism. I already see some reactions in the audience. 56% a positive view of capitalism. In contrast, only 28% of seniors have a positive view of socialism, while 61% have a favorable view of capitalism. This may give the impression that young people are trending socialist. So I put this in picture form for you to understand why this is so scandalous. Could it be that the youth are looking for alternatives to capitalism and the free market? Well, this wasn't the only study. So I'll get to the serious ones in a minute. But just for curiosity or just for fun, I ran a Google autofill search to see what I could find. Are people really more or less interested in free markets? So the first one is just the autofill, free markets. Here are the most popular returns on the autofill feature. Free markets definition, so people are asking, what the heck are they? Free markets near me, so some people might be wondering if there are any left. Free markets don't exist, so some people are looking for evidence to argue against their market defenders. Free markets work, so same thing. I know this is very scientific, so I went back and I did a trend search. And what I found was that there really was no interest in free markets. But if you look at the trends and you switch the word free markets with capitalism, there's a spike. So here's one search on the above graph, free markets or capitalism. Over time, there is a spike. So it turns out we do care about capitalism, but especially when bad things happen and people lose money. Now, what if we switch this to socialism? It turns out that there are two spikes, which reinforces the idea that there may be a resurgence of interest in socialism and perhaps among millennials. Okay, let's go to a little more academic resource. Here's a snapshot from Global Indicator Database from Pew. So the question was, please tell me whether you completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree with the following statements. Most people are better off in a free market economy, even though some people are rich and some people are poor. And if you look at the line at the bottom, so you might have to look at the other two screens there. In the United States, positive answers, in other words, those answering yes, most people are better off, even though there is some inequality, has gone down. Same thing for the United Kingdom, at least since 2002. So this is in your lifetime. So what if we compared responses from other major economies around the world? And this is a global attitudes survey. And the question was, most people are better off in a free market, even though there are disparities. That's the question. And the answers are, more people in China agree with this statement than in the United States and the UK. So the plot thickens. The title of this article was, China's government may be socialist, but its people embrace capitalism. Okay, so what is happening? And this would take a lot more time than we have. And you would have to look at this kind of data, which breaks down attitudes into slightly higher resolution categories. It turns out it's not just the youth, but other factors. So demographics, family income, education levels, political views. And we could have a conference on all of those topics, how they relate. What I want to do now is turn to the reaction from the academia and from the media. Harvard University picks up on this story, this is 2016, trying to confirm the findings from the Reason poll. And here's what they found. The Harvard University survey polled young adults between age 18 and 29 and found that 51% of respondents do not support capitalism. Just 42% said they did. And so in other words, by 2016, this question of are millennials looking around for alternatives was something that people couldn't ignore. So media on the left jumped on the story and essayists rushed to explain the findings. I should have said media on the left and right. The left narrative went something like this. So millennials are interested in socialism, but it's not true, argued the Huffington Post editorial, that millennials are lazy and simply favor the thought of redistributing wealth from the richest to the not so rich. To understand the millennial flirtation with socialism, the argument goes, you have to understand two pivotal moments in their lives. The 80s, which was a horrifying mix of big banks, big money, big hair. Also, movies like Wall Street and the phrase, greed is good. Then the crash of 2007 and 8, which was a horrifying mix of lost jobs, lost houses, and a loss of faith in trickle-down economics. In short, according to the writer, they watched their parents work hard to get ahead only to end up bankrupt due to job losses or other things out of their control. The narrative on the right went something like this. The National Review editors agreed that it's not laziness that explains millennial interest in socialism. To understand rising millennial infidelity, that's my phrase, that's not theirs, to the capitalist system, you have to understand or appreciate the power of the universities, whose influences on the way young people think about capitalism are finally starting to bear fruit after a 200-year effort to capture the levers of cultural power. Radical leftists, so goes the argument, have been failing in politics but winning in Hollywood, the media, the churches, and the schools. So the argument is not that socialist professors have succeeded in persuading their students to love Karl Marx. Rather, they have succeeded in changing the conversation from a view of the comparative flaws or defects of capitalism and socialism to simply training their students to identify the particular flaws of capitalism. A third interpretation presents itself from reason and from the libertarian point of view. The coverage there was skeptical of both camps. The libertarian spin goes something like this. First, read the subtitle here. Seize the means of production? Meh. Millennials love private enterprise as long as you don't call it capitalism. The reason behind that point is worth thinking about. According to reason, both sides are simply overstating the case. 20-somethings are not clamoring for the government to seize the means of production, which is the boomer definition of socialism. When you pull closer and ask people to define their terms, turns out they simply do not have clear concepts of these economic philosophies. Socialism does not mean a government-managed economy. Socialism means something like private enterprise with safety nets. So, more subsidized healthcare, student loan forgiveness, mandatory paid parental leave. Socialism is not Karl Marx and union halls and union halls. Socialism is Bernie Sanders and Twitter. Capitalism, on the other hand, is not the family-owned bodega, or I've recently learned that it's in New York, Brodega. On the corner, or your friend's artisanal cupcake business, or your legal weed shop. Free enterprise. Instead, millennials identify capitalism with big banks, Wall Street, income inequality, wealthy sociopaths screwing over the little guy, Bernie Madoff, and horrifying sweatshops in China. So where does this leave us? And here's my 2 cents and the thesis for today. A, there appears to be a growing generational disconnect between younger and older Americans on the primary meaning of socialism. The social problem that this generates is significant. It means that it is becoming more difficult to have a reasonable discussion of the merits of free market capitalism, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So that's my claim. It means that without a reasonable discussion of the good and bad consequences of free markets, we can't have a balanced and reasonable discussion of the good and bad consequences of the alternatives, socialism in particular. So that's my claim. The question is, what can we do about it? And my answer in advance is, read about the history of capitalism. Henry has written at least 2 very good books on this point. You might say, in anticipation of your objection, you want us to read about the history of economics? I'm already bored. And my answer would be, good. It's good that you think the history of commerce will bore you. It means you won't be disappointed. Okay. So there's another problem with my solution, which is it's an extremely vast literature, so how do we get a handle on it? Let me just give you a brief introduction to the topic, sort of a bird's eye view, or one bird's eye view, let's say. The best introduction, the one that I like the most, is an article, by an economist and a historian of economics, Albert Hirschman. He publishes a short article on a big topic, on how millennials and, on how intellectuals have justified market society throughout history. And so Hirschman essentially just reads all of the arguments on all sides. Okay. So everything that he can get his hands on, from the ancient Greeks to medieval Christianity to the early Enlightenment philosophers and reactionaries. And his basic claim in that review was that the original hope for capitalism, or for commerce, was not that commercialization would make people rich. The hope of commercialization was that it would force societies out of barbarism and continental war and aristocratic hierarchies and embedded markets, which is to say, the original hope for free markets in the 18th century was that commercialization was an essential ingredient in the civilization and liberalization of the West. So this perspective is important for 2 reasons. First, to understand the perils and the problems of capitalism that came after, it's good to know something about its original promise, which is easy to forget. Second, and this is crucial, that commercialization and free markets were encouraged by defenders as an alternative to imperial continental empire. And let me give you an example that might help. How many of you have played the video game Civilization or heard of it? By Sid Meier. You will know that, if you haven't played the game, by the way, there are multiple ways to achieve world victory. And one way is through domination. It's called a domination victory. And how do you win? You capture every capital in the world and raise everything else to the ground. But there's multiple ways to win the game. One is domination, which is fun if you enjoy power and destruction and are not overly burdened by moral reservations. In Civilization, there's another route. You can win through culture and through science and through an economic victory. That's what these people meant. You can win through commercial civilization instead of winning by capturing every capital on the board through domination. That's what capitalism was about. So yes, the profit motive. Yes, self-interest. Yes, inequality. Few of the early modern defenders of capitalism denied that capitalism would generate those things. But all of its defenders, including John Locke, Adam Smith, and my favorite, Baron de Montesquieu, thought that this was a trade-off that was worth making. So, going back to Hirschman, he gave a name to this. It's called du commerce. This means soft commerce, gentle commerce. And all he meant by this was that free markets are a powerful moralizing agent which brings many non-material improvements to society, even though a bit of hypocrisy may have to be accepted into the bargain. So there's actually 3 points there. It's a moralizing agent, brings non-material improvements to society, and there's a downside. It's not a panacea. It's not a utopia. It's a trade-off, and it might involve a little hypocrisy in the bargain. The question is it worth it? So let's turn to the first part of that thesis. Montesquieu was the first to formulate it. He says it's almost a general rule that wherever manners are gentle, there is commerce. And whenever there is commerce, manners are gentle. Let's pause. Notice the words. Montesquieu, as you now see for yourself, never made the claim that markets make people virtuous. He never claimed that it would usher in a new liberal utopia. The specific claim is that manners are more gentle in free market societies than in anti-market or pre-market societies. Simply, he meant the way to the top, the way to distinguish yourself in a commercial society, as opposed to an aristocratic or military or theocratic society, is through innovation and hard work. It's important to get this right. The claim is not that markets make people more virtuous, if by virtuous you mean more patriotic, more public-spirited, more selfless, more altruistic, more pious. The claim is that commercial relations make people more gentle. So Adam Smith wrote after Montesquieu, expands on this idea, famously observes that the Dutch, who are the most commercial nation in the world, are also the most faithful to their word. So honesty, smaller virtues, the so-called bourgeois virtues. So commerce, in other words, doesn't make everyone into saints, but it does tend to have a restraining effect on would-be tyrants and cheats. At the last minute, I threw this in there just because I couldn't help myself, but 4 days ago I had a chance to visit Montesquieu's chateau, palace, castle in France, and had a very interesting discussion with some of his existing family and scholars who work on Montesquieu today about his influence today, which is still very, very much alive. Now, if you're interested, there are 3 books that you can look into that summarize this idea of the bourgeois virtues very nicely, by Deirdre McCloskey from Harvard. Let's turn to the possible objection. What could you say against this idea that commerce will unleash these commercial virtues and that our aim should be material improvement and increasing the standard of living for everyone, and that the goal of society and for individuals is the accumulation of wealth and profit? So I have an Onion article to share with you that might help to illustrate one possible objection. Here's the Onion. Okay, so first of all, just to set up. The argument is that it creates gentle manners, but it also is very much more productive. It creates more stuff. Okay, I haven't even touched on that. Pope Francis reverses position on capitalism after seeing wide variety of American Oreos. Let's read the quote here. Admitting the startling discovery had compelled him to re-examine his long-held beliefs, His Holiness Pope Francis announced on Tuesday that he had reversed his critical stance towards capitalism after seeing the immense variety of Oreos available in the United States. Oh my goodness, look at all these. Golden Oreos, cookie dough Oreos, mega stuff, birthday cake. Perhaps the system of free enterprise is not as terrible as I once feared. Okay. So this article nicely illustrates the familiar problem that there's more to life than money. Free enterprise may produce more abundance, more cookie dough Oreos, and the rush to create or to produce and to consume more cookie dough Oreos might bring, Montesquieu said entraîne, which just means with it, along with it, certain politically useful virtues, but does free enterprise really provide more meaning as well? On this, the 18th century market optimists might seem vulnerable to the charge that capitalism produces a variety of choices that are devoid of meaning. Let's move on to the second claim, and then I'll go to the summary. The second part of the du commerce claim was not just that it works on the individual level. According to Montesquieu, commerce also has beneficial side effects which compound the positive effects on the individual level. The most important, to condense a long story, is that commerce favors international peace. So in Montesquieu's original formulation, the natural effect of commerce is to lead to peace. And there's two parts to this claim. One is that it leads to more peaceful relations within society, and the second part is that it leads to more peaceful relations between societies on the international level. Just think about the peace within society part. People within society that trade are more likely, if they have radically different views, especially religious views, to have to deal with each other. So, literally, deal with each other. And the most famous example of this argument comes from Voltaire, in a controversial but important passage from the Philosophical Letters. I'll just read you this very quickly. For context, Voltaire is visiting London, obviously from France, and it's a great deal more religiously tolerant than the Paris of his time. And he goes into a stock market exchange, and he says this: "Go into the exchange in London, that place more venerable than many a court, and you will see representatives of all the nations assembled there for the profit of mankind. There, the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal with one another as if they were of the same religion, and reserve the name of infidel for those who go bankrupt." Adam Smith's claim was that there's a deep connection between freedom of belief and commerce, and that's Voltaire's point. In a commercial society, the necessity of trading your service for money outweighs and competes and often drowns out the desire to argue about religious issues that could otherwise divide us. In the case of the London Stock Exchange, things like whether people agree on baptism, whether they agree or disagree on circumcision, or whether they agree or disagree on wearing a hat. This concept then gets applied to the international level, which I'm going to skip now just for time. All right, let's turn to that last part about the bargain. The claim, to summarize, was never that free market capitalism would bring out the best in people all the time and in every way. Moreover, the best and most serious thinkers on this subject did not believe that free markets left to themselves could produce conditions favorable to its perpetuation. Montesquieu, and especially Adam Smith and Locke and other classical liberals, argued that a free market could not thrive without non-market institutions, whether that is the family, the state, or community, or universities like Utah Valley University. These non-market institutions provide avenues to nourish non-market virtues. But they also, going back to our problem about meaning and the Oreos, they also allow the enjoyment of higher order goods. They remind us that there is a scale of values, and that the creation of wealth and the spending of money are a means and not an end in itself. This last point is not a partisan point. It could be addressed equally to critics of the free market as to market fundamentalists. The idea that markets could be relied on to provide us with the only source of social morality and meaning was not only dangerously naive, it would paradoxically undermine the perpetuation of modern economics and ultimately the free market itself. And that's why I call this presentation somewhat lovingly Free Market Myopia. Okay, a few thoughts by way of conclusion. The first thing is that, going back to this picture, okay, our question, okay, what does this have to do with millennials? So let's go back to our picture. We have to correct the picture. If you read these articles, actually what was so shocking for many of these writers was not just that young people might be interested in socialism, but that they were being attracted to a philosophy of socialism, or a kind of socialism, by a septuagenarian. So we'll fix the picture for you. Some of you are my students, and you're thinking, you couldn't possibly make that more awkward, and I just did. You know me, so, okay. What does this have to do with millennials? I'm just going to leave you with a few concluding thoughts. First, the debate over the virtues and vices of free markets have changed over time. So on a macro scale, the debate has shifted. This is part of Professor Clark's point. In its 18th century form, it was essentially between commerce or conquest. Its 19th century form was essentially a choice between industry and labor. Its 20th century form was freedom and equality, or versus equality. And so recognizing those shifts and understanding this history would be a good starting point for understanding this most recent shift, which seems to be generational, with sides aligning against each other on the question of the size of the government safety net. We can generate two implications from this. First, in terms of education, it's fairly clear that a lack of historical awareness is feeding this growing generational disconnect. I believe that the consequences for the future is that we are likely to see more rather than less confusion, and more rather than less frustration. If we don't make a better effort at clarifying our terms, defining the words we throw around, and ideally encouraging each other to educate ourselves on economics. I'm going to apologize to the economists in the room, but the cliche is true. Economics really is too important to be left to the economists. Finally, on millennials. The bad news, if you're on the National Review side of things, is that the drumbeat and warning messages and hand-wringing about the evils of government ownership may not be reaching them in the way that you think they are. Conservatives must realize that since the end of the Cold War, capitalism is more likely to mean crony capitalism or government favoritism, while socialism is more likely to imply protecting the vulnerable from the vicissitudes of capitalism. So they may not just be aware that true socialism means that the government would own the banks, run the car companies, take over their favorite things, Uber, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. And so on that note, conservatives might want to remember that the constant barrage of socialist name-calling might actually be improving millennials' opinions of the politicians that you oppose the most. Finally, if you're on the Huffington Post side of things, the bad news for you, I think, is that millennials are just not as enthusiastic for socialism defined as government-managed economy. Or to put this more simply, millennial preferences may not be so different from older generations once terms are defined. And so I'll end on the good news for all of us. The good news, I would argue, is that we are unlikely to see a society-splitting generational civil war where millennials dump capitalism for the new, sexier socialism. More likely is that we are going to see a productive tension going forward with people on both sides coming to realize that the loyalty of the millennials is something that neither side, left or right, can be taken for granted. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here this early. I'm very thankful to the Center for Constitutional Studies for the invitation to be here and to speak to you. I'm on sabbatical back at my home institution in the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, so I don't get to interact with students very much. So I'm really happy to see a bunch of students here and excited to talk with you this morning. Our topic, as you know by now, of course, for this panel is free markets, society, and law. I think it's especially important that we're talking about this subject of free markets as part of our celebration of Constitution Week because, as we know, the Constitution's preamble mentions that one of the purposes of our Constitution is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And our economic freedom is definitely one of these critical blessings that we need to preserve for ourselves and for our posterity. What I want to talk about are some myths and some confusion. We've really already heard about a little bit so far on this panel having to do with economic freedom. What is economic freedom? What does it mean to have a free market? There's a lot of confusion today about those questions. There's a lot of confusion about what it really means to have a free market, and my goal will be to clear up a couple of these confusions. Some people believe that a free market means something like the following: businesses getting away with whatever evil schemes they can possibly devise, polluted water, adulterated food, dirty air, irresponsible lending by greedy bankers, and generally bad behavior by profit-seeking corporations. On the other side, there are many who think a free market means no regulation whatsoever, and that regulation is an infringement upon our natural rights to liberty and property, and that regulation means that we tend towards an all-powerful leviathan that takes away our freedom. Both of these views, I think, are misguided. The truth about regulation and its relationship to economic freedom lies somewhere between these two extremes. What both sides that I've just laid out fail to understand is that some regulations are perfectly compatible with economic freedom. Economic freedom even requires some regulation for it to exist. And we have always had regulation in America in order to preserve a truly free market. But the reasons that are used to justify some regulations cannot be used to justify all regulation. And so we must understand the proper role of regulation if we're going to differentiate between the legitimate kinds of regulation that promote economic freedom and those that might be in tension with economic freedom. The reason we need regulation is simple. Freedom does not give someone the right to injure another person. Economic regulation, therefore, is legitimate when it enhances freedom or prevents the injurious use of freedom by preventing injury to others' natural rights. So I want to address two myths by way of sort of demonstrating my hypothesis. I think it's unequivocally true that our political system was founded to preserve economic freedom and to preserve free markets. But there are two myths about what this means. The first myth is historical. You may have heard this myth before, that prior to, say, 1900, life in America or the economy in America was totally unregulated. You've probably heard the phrase laissez-faire, right? Just let it be. Let whatever happened in the economy happen without any guidance from government whatsoever. Many people believe that prior to 1900, this is the way that the economy worked in America. That America was an unregulated, laissez-faire system where government played no role in guiding the economic choices or behavior of individuals. This myth, this is demonstrably false. This is a myth. Prior to the Civil War, American state and national governments regulated a lot of different things. I'll give you a few examples. Medical professionals could not practice without a license in most states prior to the Civil War. Innkeepers and auctioneers could not practice their trades without a license from the state government. Doctors who were unlicensed could not collect fees from their patients in a court of law. And in some cases, Massachusetts provides us a few cases of this. If we look back into the history, doctors were actually fined by the state government for practicing without a license. In one case, a bone setter and healer of sprains was fined by the government because he didn't get a license from the state. This is not something new. This is what was happening actually a long time ago. At the state level, banks could not operate without a specific charter granted to them by the state government. And in many of the states, the state government would grant a charter to the bank and set a maximum rate of interest they could charge for lending. So there were all kinds of strings attached to the charters that the banks would receive. Regulations restricted the kinds of cemeteries that you could set up within city limits and where they could be set up. State governments even required inspections before you could sell goods like salt and butter and lumber and beef and other kinds of things. The ownership and use of water was regulated extensively by state governments. This is just a sample of the kinds of regulations that predominated in the economic history of this country prior to the Civil War. Far from a laissez-faire free-for-all, early American economic history is full of regulation. Prominent founders such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton actually defended these regulations in their writings. Hamilton wrote this: "The idea of laissez-faire, when taken as a general rule, is true, but as an exclusive one is false and leads to error in the administration of public affairs." James Madison wrote this: "The true policy will be found to lie between the extremes of doing nothing and prescribing everything, between admitting no exceptions to the rule of laissez-faire and converting the exceptions into the rule." Both Hamilton and Madison knew that there were limits to regulation, but they knew that regulations were exceptions to a general rule that economic activity should be free from government interference, but they knew that regulations were legitimate and that there had to be regulation. This leads me to the second myth I want to address. The second myth is not a historical myth, but a philosophical one. This philosophical myth claims the following: our natural rights to liberty and property require an unregulated economic system where government plays no role in limiting our economic action or choices. That is a myth. It is true that our Constitution's framers believed that we have natural rights to liberty and property. A bunch of documents, the Declaration of Independence and state declarations of rights, talk about our natural rights to liberty and property. But just because we have natural rights to liberty and property does not mean that government regulation is incompatible with those rights. In fact, most of the Constitution's framers believed that without regulation, our natural rights to liberty and property would actually be insecure. In other words, regulations could actually protect our rights to liberty and property, not violate them. Rights require government action for their protection. So when these kinds of regulations, the ones that I just talked about, were challenged by people in courts of law, the judges would have to write opinions saying why a regulation was legitimate rather than a violation of someone's rights. And the judges would offer one of two reasons in support of regulation. The first reason they would give, the first argument they would give, was that a regulation was legitimate because it prevented one person from injuring another person. This was very common in environmental regulations, which existed prior to the Civil War. Just as no person has the right to directly physically injure another person, so also no person has the right to injure the property of another by setting up, say, a pigsty next to them and emitting foul odors and other kinds of things onto their property. No person has the right to use his property to injure another by, say, polluting their drinking water. These kinds of regulations were upheld by judges because they believed that your natural rights to liberty and property require these kinds of regulations to protect them. So some regulations are legitimate in their eyes because they protect natural rights. The second argument that was often given in defense of regulation was that a regulation expanded the natural rights of everybody. Some regulations, these judges argued, actually gave everyone more natural rights. They gave everyone more rights to liberty or to property. Here, the best example that they came up with was the inspections regulations that I just talked about. regulations saying you can't sell certain goods unless they've been inspected by a government official. When the judges had to write opinions defending these regulations, they said, well, these regulations provide mechanisms for preventing fraud. And therefore, they allow consumers to purchase goods more confidently. And therefore, they expand the rights of everybody in a market, the sellers as well as the buyers, to engage in transactions that are truly voluntary. You don't engage in a voluntary transaction when you don't know what goods you are buying. And so inspections regulations, they argued, were not violations of someone's property rights, but rather ways of protecting those rights. Here, then, regulations actually expanded rights rather than restricting them. James Wilson, one of the founders who's not well known but probably should be better known, wrote this about these kinds of regulations. Every citizen will gain more freedom than he can lose by such prohibitions. He will gain more freedom than he will lose by such prohibitions. That regulations allow you to gain more freedom than you have to give up. So these were the justifications for regulation in early American history. Now, of course, simply because the founders of our country supported regulation does not mean that all regulation is legitimate. Today, our government uses regulation to do things that our founders probably would have thought tyrannical. So there are regulations today that don't meet these criteria. But it is important to see that some regulations actually do meet those criteria and therefore are part of preserving and promoting a free market. When looking at regulation, then, the right question to ask is whether it is related to the proper goals of regulation, protecting natural rights by preventing injury, or expanding the rights of all. Many regulations today don't meet this standard, but some actually do. The abuse of regulation is not a reason to reject all regulation. Both sides of the contemporary debate over economic freedom would benefit from understanding this point. For defenders of the free market, being able to defend the right kinds of regulations allows them to avoid being caricatured by their opponents. If you are a believer in the free market, knowing that some regulation is legitimate enables you to make a much better case for your position. Those who are skeptical of the free market should also be aware of this history, because it would enable them to understand the free market not as an evil place where the strongest get to do whatever they want, but as a place where people use their freedom responsibly and government has a role to play. So I'll conclude with this thought. Both sides in the contemporary debate over economic freedom miss an important part of the truth. One side tends to treat regulation as illegitimate, regardless of what it actually does. The other side tends to think there are no limits to regulation whatsoever. I think if you look at early American history, you see there's a third way out of this problem. And an important way if we're going to think politically about what's coming next. Understanding this is more important probably now than it ever has been. If we are living in a country where regulation is broken, then it is critical that we understand the path out of that situation. Abolishing all regulation and all bureaucracy is not politically possible, nor is it politically desirable. The free market thrives under the right kind of regulation. And that's the kind of regulation that we should be looking to promote. Thanks.
I sat down after very briefly introducing this panel, and then I thought I did everyone a disservice by not describing their qualifications in some detail. But we do have materials ready that have that. And as I look back on it, I'm really glad I didn't, because it reminded me of my first year of law school. Everybody in the first year of law school learns the phrase res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. And so it was with this panel. I think, not that their thing, but this panel spoke for itself. It is hard for me to imagine, and I want to thank Andy in particular, who helped put this panel together, and each of the panelists, that you could have orchestrated it better. It almost sounded like a symphony. Having said that, we have some time for some questions, as we had hoped to. It is always my policy to first say to the panelists, you may each ask a question if you like. Otherwise, we're going to make it into a free market and let everyone have at it. Any things? Yeah, please.
Just a couple of kind of supplements to the excellent papers that Andy and Joe have just given. Concise and brilliant sort of introduction to the current debate over the virtues or the vices of capitalism. And the only thing I would add to that is, in Deirdre McCloskey's Bourgeois Virtues, which was the first of the 3 big doorstop 500-plus page books that she's written on that topic, I have assigned to my students on occasion the very first chapter of the Bourgeois Virtues itself. It's called An Apologia for Capitalism. It's about 50 pages long, and in neat summary order, she goes through about 10 or 12 of the most standard arguments against capitalism, and in her inimitable style, she addresses each and every one of them, and it's an exhilarating experience. I can't think of a better introduction to the big picture debates that Andy was raising. And then ever so briefly on Joe's excellent talk, if you Google the phrase regulatory capture, I think you'll be introduced to a good literature that is one of the reasons why there is such hostility to the regime of regulation today. And it's something that Madison and Hamilton, of course, they hadn't heard of regulatory capture, although they were certainly familiar enough with the phenomenon. What it suggests is that if that even the best intentioned and most sensible looking regulations have a tendency, not always but sometimes, to be played, to be finessed by the most powerful and well-connected individuals in that particular industry or that particular activity. And I'll just give one small example that Joe himself mentioned, and that is the inspection regime. There was a debate in 18th century France as to whether a good should be inspected in the rigorous sort of way that the French monarchy tended to do. Well, it turns out historians have discovered those who were most in favor of that regime were the producers of certain goods who had been made under a very careful guild-based regime of restrictions on the content and the quality of goods. And they were using it as a way of keeping out people who might have different ideas as to how they might make their product or what they might like to sell. So I think a certain degree of skepticism is always in order when any new regulation is proposed because of the dangers of regulatory capture.
Questions? Please, Shep.
I'd be interested in a little bit of perspective thoughts on this. Every year, I think the Wall Street Journal puts out an issue. You're familiar with this column, I think, that lists the free market economies of the world and kind of relates them to political economies. I'm interested if you wouldn't mind commenting on that and kind of saying which economies in the world or countries in the world do you think are doing well, so we can get kind of an actual example, and which ones should be doing better, maybe historically have done better and are slipping back. I think we all can kind of tell if that's the cases, but if you want to talk about that, that's fine. But I'm curious to see on a kind of a sweep of the global, some countries seem to be slipping and why, and some seem to be moving up and why. If you don't feel comfortable with that, I understand, but you've got more knowledge than anybody else in the room does, and it's kind of fun to see what you think about these things.
Who wants to take? So there are multiple organizations that publish economic freedom indices, measuring different countries and how economically free they are. Most of them have come to the same conclusion, which is that the country that is falling on those rankings is the United States. We have become significantly less free in the last 10 years. I think the financial crisis played a very large role in that. countries that have become more free economically would surprise a lot of people. Canada would be an example. New Zealand. And this one always raises eyebrows. Many of the Scandinavian countries have actually instituted a lot of free market reforms. As far as what has caused those developments, that's a really hard question to answer. But in some ways, American politics has become a very locked-in kind of system in which it's very hard to make any kinds of changes. We're pretty familiar with that over the last few months, right? Our government is not really adept at moving quickly or responding quickly in response to changes in the electorate. Whereas other countries seem to have done a better job reforming their regulatory systems. So I'll just give you one quick example. Regulatory budgets. This is an interesting idea that many other countries outside the United States use, where you give an agency a budget, you say you can impose this amount of economic burden on the system every year. Other countries use those, and it's not seen as this really controversial idea. When you propose them in the United States, people flip out and say this is some radical new policy idea. So in some ways, our system doesn't respond as well as these other systems to different ideas and new ways of thinking.
Yes, please.
Is that just because we're too big? I mean, the argument obviously comes in for regulation, the difference between a centralized government and a localized government, right? I mean, isn't that part of the debate of good regularization?
I have just my sense of that is, this is Constitution Week, so take what I say with somewhat of a grain of salt. There are problems with our Constitution that make us less flexible than other countries. I'm thinking especially of our separation of power system. So it was designed to work a certain way, namely to be really slow in response to changes. Think about it, you have to win the House, you have to win the Senate, totally different constituencies. And then to keep the Senate majority, you've got to win a third of the seats or enough of the third of the seats every 2 years to maintain your majority. And then you have to hope that the president's not going to veto any legislation you pass. This makes our system very slow to adapt, as opposed to, say, parliamentary systems where the whole thing sweeps through the system very quickly. There's a great virtue in having this system that's slow and gridlocked and clunky, but when you need things to change quickly, it's a tough system to work with, as opposed to, say, parliamentary systems where elections have real consequences.
Other? Please.
I was interested in Henry Clark's statements a little bit about the old trade system and then the modern trade system and so forth. The guilds themselves were a form of licensure, weren't they? And when we adopted the guilds into our system, so to speak, through licensures and so forth, we see the same disadvantages that the guild system had, as I see it. For instance, those who would create licensures on state levels and so forth to prevent others who might be in the same profession from entering into the state. We see that in areas such as massage therapy and chiropractic practices and other things. I don't know what our system can do about that, again, because of the slowness of the system. But I've seen some of the outcome of that has actually prevented creativity rather than allowing the market to actually create even more in some of the fields. One of the suggestions might be that as we look at laws and at guilds and so forth, or licensures, that maybe we look at definitions also, as pointed out by Andrew. The definitions change, and often the law doesn't provide definitions of what they mean, such as in the medical profession in many of the states. If you have if you want to prescribe and you want to diagnose, that is left so open that a parent, by saying to their child, you have a cold, you need to take some vitamin C, has just broken the law because they're not licensed to say that. Now, obviously, it's not being observed, and there's extensions. But I'm suggesting maybe even more definition within the laws might actually provide the area that you talked about with being able to focus that licensure and those laws towards benefiting the whole rather than individuals. Now, maybe I'm way off on this, but just looking to what you said, that seems to be an area that we could focus on as citizens.
Excellent point, excellent question. I'm not an expert on American state licensure, although I'm aware that there is a literature out there on it. But I could offer one thought about the European guilds, and then those of you who know the American scene might apply it to what you know. There's an enormous debate among European historians. When the guilds were first established in, let's say, the 11th or 12th century, when European towns and cities were first being formed, the guilds offered a function of enabling the merchants to defend themselves against the predatory actions of governments. So it was a way of protecting themselves against an otherwise larger and more powerful force. And in that way, you can see the guilds as contributing in sort of the way that Joe was discussing, facilitating trade, facilitating economic activity. By the 18th century, the guilds had also acquired all kinds of other functions, many of which were to keep out the opposition, keep out competition, to limit the scope of activity, and to make economic activity itself, in some regards, a closed club. And so that was what the French revolutionaries had in mind when they lock, stock, and barrel abolished the guilds altogether in the Chapelier Law of 1791. So my question for the Americanists would be, are there positive self-protective functions in state licensure that are comparable to those of the 12th and 13th century guilds? And are they outweighed or not outweighed by the exclusionary properties of state licensure and barbering and all kinds of other things? In other words, have they become, almost by a natural process, sort of self-protecting and exclusionary entities rather than facilitating entities? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but to me that would be one way of framing the question.
Yes, in the back, please.
So I guess I'll be the first one to say that in regards to political and constitutional studies, I am very immature in those understandings and whatnot. But I'm a student of Dr. Bibby, and I just came really late into this talk. But in regards to millennials and them being drawn into more of that social aspect, more so than capitalism and whatnot, it's pretty interesting to me to think about this. I just recently read a speech by Theodore Roosevelt, The Duties of American Citizenship. If you have not read that, I recommend it. But he talks about getting involved in politics at a very young age, and I wonder how mature the millennial generation is in understanding these political and constitutional affairs, that maybe they have a misunderstanding that maybe draws them to socialism or capitalism on both sides, either or. And it's just interesting to me to think, what are we doing as a nation that we're getting our young generation into understanding political and constitutional affairs, so that at that young age, they're then developing a maturity for the coming years in protecting our constitutional rights in the future. I just wonder what your understanding or what your feelings are towards that, if you feel like this generation is immature in our understandings and we're making very quick judgments and we don't fully understand. I'd love to hear from Dr. Bibby, as he is my teacher, but if any others as well, that'd be great.
Let me, if I may, also make a friendly amendment. My students will permit me to do this, and you can always say no. But it does occur to me as you talk about educating, and I have had in my home 11 millennials, and they've been from all over the world. They've been from China, they've been from South America, Albania, and then my own children. And I don't know what world they're from. But in some respect, it seems to me, you begin with this generation, and even mine to some extent, with branding. If you were to ask any of those 11 in my home, would you rather be called progressive, socialist, capitalist, or conservative? They all think of themselves as progressive. It is curious to me that in this educational effort and trying to maintain the market, that they've done such a poor job of their own business, and that's branding. So what, together I think we're asking what might be done.
Well, I hope I'm not misleading the flock. Anyway, what might be done? I mean, there's one study that we didn't have a chance to talk about, but they follow up on some of these younger generations, Gen Z, and start asking them about how their values or opinions change over time. And there's some evidence coming in that, to put this fairly simply, once they start paying taxes, sometimes their opinions change. In terms of what to do, the other text that I would add to your pile, if you have a chance, would be a book called The Mind and the Market by Jerry Muller. And his basic argument is that economics is more than economic growth, and that the history of capitalism is intertwined. I don't want to say embedded, because that has an ambiguous meaning, but embedded with cultural institutions. In terms of Joseph's point on the Economic Liberty Index, that's an interesting source to look at. But I would also look at the World Values Survey. I'm not sure where it's at right now, but Ronald Engelhardt from the University of Michigan used to work on this quite a bit. And what's interesting about the World Values Survey is that they compare or try to correlate measures of economic growth with measures of reported or self-reported well-being. And so you can find a lot of interesting data. I would encourage you to look at that, because what it raises is sort of two questions. So one is, do you like the society or economic system that you live in? And to try to start answering that, you need to ask, compared to what? So at the risk of trying a joke this early in the morning, someone comes up to a female professor and says, "How's your husband?" And she says, "Compared to what?" And that's actually the right question for economic history. And what it drives is this bigger question of, what are the cultural preconditions of economic liberty and economic growth?
We have time for one more question. Please.
Okay, so, I've, become more concerned about our generation, basically turning against constitutional values and more towards socialism and other ideas like that. So, I'm just wondering, what, we can do, as millennials or college students to make most of our efforts in protecting the Constitution and liberty and free markets.
Teach. Teach at any level you can do that. And before you do that, read a lot. So one of the things that's happened over the last 100 years that I think has changed the way people understand the Constitution or our political system is that the universities have not done a very good job of teaching. And so it's no surprise that when an educational system moves in a certain direction, that society goes along with it. And so I think the alternative then is to teach.
I would certainly echo that, and I would add a couple of other brief points as well. One, let's remember that the word capitalism was invented by its enemies, basically. My friend Steve Marks has written a book on this, the Information Nexus, in which he traces the term capitalism in the 19th century. Adam Smith never used the term capitalism. Adam Smith said that in the modern kind of society that all of us want to live in, every person is, in fact, a merchant. We are buying and selling from each other. We are selling our basket of assets, if you will, our qualities, our skills, and we're trying to develop and maximize our skills. And so part of the problem then is that the question you ask has been around for a couple of hundred years, and the deck has been stacked against those who believe in what he called commercial society. And so you might consider whether you really want to use the word capitalism, actually. Unfortunately, I can't think of necessarily a better word. Smith's word was commercial society. It's a pretty good word. But capitalism is an awfully confusing thing, and as Andy pointed out in his excellent talk, it confuses matters. People who are in favor of a free market economy are not necessarily the same people that are in favor of a capitalist economy. And the other thing, digging a little deeper, Steven Pinker, the cognitive psychologist, suggests that we have a kind of evolved intuitive bias against some of the basic principles of a free market economy, especially the principle of positive sum exchange. We have a tendency to think in terms of zero-sum exchange. I want to get exactly back what I gave you in value. Whereas an entire free market economy is based on the proposition that each of us gains when we engage in exchange, rather than simply engaging in the kind of evolved, primitive, tit-for-tat reciprocity that our ancestors thousands of years ago engaged in. Which means that, as Joe was suggesting, teach is really the answer. And we need to be constantly teaching ourselves, too. We need to be constantly making an effort to overcome our evolutionary or our intuitive biases against the idea of a whole society being organized around positive sum exchange. So we need to be reminding people of how much they actually have benefited from having been born into and grown up in a society that is dedicated to positive sum exchange.
And, a quick note, we will regather at 10 o'clock. I did want to make an observation in light of that question, and it was a great lesson I learned from my father and that you wonderfully reiterated. It was 1964. I was not yet quite a teenager, and Barry Goldwater was running against Lyndon Baines Johnson. And my family, my father and mother, were strong Democrats, strong LBJ people. So I came home with grand delight and announced that I had defeated David Irvine in a debate. He supported Goldwater, and I supported Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I said, and I won. And my father said, you will not speak again until you know better the other side. So he gave me a handful of books. He took me to Barry Goldwater rally in Chavez Ravine, 54,000 people there. And then, so to teach, we must learn. And I just can't emphasize that enough. And that's why we're nonpartisan in the center. We don't think the truth, whatever it may be, needs any false props. What it needs is a level playing field. And so, learn, that you might teach that this might be the kind of world we all want for ourselves and our children. We'll be back at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, is this? Hello? Ah, there we go. Good morning. My name is Michael Good. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and Political Science. I'm an early American historian, and I'm also the scholar in residence for the Center for Constitutional Studies this year. I have the honor of moderating this panel, Property, Takings, and the Constitution. We're going to actually have the speakers present in reverse order that is listed on the brochure, the conference brochure. So our first speaker will be Chuck Cohen. Chuck Cohen is the Associate Professor of Law at Capital University Law School since 2003. His areas of expertise include real property, takings, and eminent domain law. Cohen was formerly an attorney with the law firm of Farella, Braun, and Martel in San Francisco, where his work focused on property, bankruptcy transactions, and litigation. He holds a BA cum laude in General Studies and History at Harvard University and a JD cum laude at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. I also like to try to, when I'm introducing speakers, to come up with some fun facts about the speakers. And unfortunately, both Charles Cohen and Chuck Cohen are such common names. I came up with lots of individuals, and most of the times, these were not, they had nothing to do with our speaker. So, but I found your CV, and I did find that Chuck has experience as a journalist, including working for the New York Times Transfax, which was, this is an institution in the New York Times that in 1990 they used to send out articles to military overseas bases and expat Americans living in Japan and elsewhere. And it was initially done by fax machine. So Chuck worked for that, for the New York Times Fax. He was also, and this is the fun fact, a staff writer for People and Money magazine. That's very glamorous. His article, Eminent Domain, After Kello versus City of New London, an argument for banning economic development of takings, appeared in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy in 2006. Our next speaker who will follow Chuck Cohen will be Molly Brady. Molly Brady is an associate professor of law at the University of Virginia. Her areas of expertise include property law and legal history. Professor Brady received her AB summa cum laude in history from Harvard, so we have two Harvard alum, also in history, so it's near and dear to my heart. Where she was at Harvard, she was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa, and her JD is from Yale Law School. At Yale, she was a co-editor-in-chief of the Yale Journal of Law and Technology and a Coker Teaching Fellow in Contract Law. She was a two-time recipient of the Parker Prize for Legal History Scholarship and was awarded the Quinton Johnston Prize in Real Property Law, among other prizes. And I had much better luck in finding, you want to guess what the fun fact I found about you? Molly, after law school, whoa, wait, this is not the fun fact, I'm sorry. After law school, Professor Brady served as a clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit and practiced law at Ropes and Gray in Boston, focusing on intellectual property transactions. So here's the fun fact about Molly. Molly was the Hartford Radcliffe Foundation for Women's Athletics Prize for the top female scholar athlete. And that's in the brochure. What the brochure doesn't tell you was that she was a hammer thrower and the co-captain of the Harvard track and field team, right? And she wrote, this is the best part, she wrote comedy for the Harvard Lampoon. She also has a passion for forensic archaeology. I don't know how you have time for all that, but be that as may. Last but certainly not least is Rodney Smith, the director, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know already, but Rodney Smith is the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University, a position he has occupied since January 2017. Rodney is formerly the director of the Sports Law and Business Program at Arizona State University. He has served as Dean of the Schools of Law at Capital University, the University of Montana, and the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and as president of Southern Virginia University. Smith also held the Herf Chair of Excellence in Law at the University of Memphis, where he emphasized constitutional law and ethics. Smith has testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and other legislative bodies regarding confirmation proceedings and constitutional issues. His scholarly work is so numerous, we could spend, I think, 15 minutes alone just talking about his publications. His work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. He is the author of numerous books and more than 25 scholarly articles. He is currently working on a book entitled James Madison and the Sacred Right of Conscience. And so without further ado, we'll start with Chuck Cohen.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction, and I'd like to thank the Center for the honor of including me in this event, particularly Dr. Smith and all of the other people who we've met, or who I've met since I've been here, who've been taking great care of us. It's been a lot. It has been a great deal of fun so far. All right, I'm going to start my stopwatch so I don't run for too long. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the Takings Clause and the meaning of public use. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to violate one of the key rules about PowerPoint, which is you are not supposed to put a lot of words on a PowerPoint that are too small to read. But I did it for a purpose. I don't want you to read all of this. It's the Fifth Amendment. Most of you are familiar with the key precepts of the Fifth Amendment. The right to be indicted for a serious crime, the right to not be compelled to self-incriminate, the protection against double jeopardy, and so on, due process. And then at the very bottom, the part that I am most interested in, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. When I teach my first-year property students, I like to joke by saying the Fifth Amendment is mostly boring, and when I read it, I go blah, 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 self-incrimination, double jeopardy, and nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Because as a property professor, that's the part that I'm most interested in. The idea here is this provision has many effects on the way government regulates property. The area that I'm going to focus on most is application of this clause in the context of the eminent domain power, which I believe most of you know is the government's inherent power to acquire property by forced sale. So if the government needs your land to build a road or a highway or a park, they can use this power to force you to sell your land to the government. And often this is very controversial, and typically the person against whom the power is being exercised is unhappy about it. So let's look at how public use, or the public use clause in the Takings Clause, applies to eminent domain. First of all, there's been a lot of debate over the years about what exactly is meant by this language that I've underlined here for public use. I mean, if you read it literally, if you're a strict constructionist and believe that the Constitution means only what it says literally, then you could possibly read this to mean that property can be taken for a private use without just compensation, right? So if the government wanted to take your land for a private use, it doesn't have to give you compensation. I mean, that's one plausible reading of the drafting of this clause. However, the courts have long ago rejected that sort of nonsensical reading and have reached the conclusion that if the eminent domain power is going to be used, it may only be used for a public use and only upon payment of just compensation. Now, what exactly does, and so the recurring themes in public use and eminent domain law are typically what is or is not a public use, and how much money is just compensation. I'm going to focus mostly on the first question, what is or is not a public use. Historically, there have been two sort of broad schools of thought on what is meant by public use. There is what is known as the narrow view. Under the narrow view, public use is satisfied if the condemned land, meaning the land that has been taken, will be put to actual use by the public or the government, which represents the public. So examples of where this would clearly be satisfied would be if the government takes land to construct a highway. That clearly satisfies the public use requirement under the narrow view, because once the highway is constructed, members of the public will be allowed to use it as a matter of right. Another example would be taking land to build a post office or some other government building. Here, the government represents the people. Since it is doing the people's work, we can say that the use they are going to make of the land is public. So that's the narrow view, and that's the view that is taken by the more conservative people who have gotten involved in this debate. They like to interpret public use as narrowly as possible because it has the effect of limiting the use of eminent domain. Then there is the other view, which I call the broad view. And under the broad view of public use, the public use is satisfied if the condemned land, after being taken, will be put to a use that produces a public benefit or advantage. In other words, it doesn't have to actually be open to use by the public, as long as the policymakers who are deciding to use the eminent domain power believe that there will be a public benefit or advantage produced by taking the land. You might say that under this interpretation, public use is synonymous with public purpose. What is the modern, and an example of a taking that would satisfy public use under the broad view would be what we call economic development takings, where the government takes land from private individuals and transfers that land to possibly other private individuals so that they can develop the land in a way that will be more economically beneficial and produce economic revitalization, tax revenue, jobs, and so on, the tax revenue, jobs, and economic revitalization being a public benefit. So which of these two rules is the prevailing modern view under existing U.S. Supreme Court case law? The answer is the broad view. The broad view is the modern view of public use. And the most recent example of this is the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Kelo v. City of New London. How many of you have heard of this case? It's a pretty well-known case. There was a movie made about it. It was very widely covered in the news media when the decision came down. Basically what happened there was the city of New London, Connecticut was very economically depressed. It had very high unemployment rate, and it decided that it would like to build a huge mixed-use development that would consist of a lot of different types of buildings. Hotels, office buildings, private homes, a high-tech research and development project. But the key was the land, after it was taken,
was going to be owned by the private developers that were going to build the project and not the government. And many of these buildings were not going to be open to the public as a matter of right. They were going to be essentially private buildings. So Suzette Kelo and some of her neighbors sued or resisted on the grounds that the intended project did not constitute a public use as required by the Constitution, and therefore the government could not use the eminent domain power to take their land. The Supreme Court rejected the homeowner's argument and held that taking homes for transfer to private developers to construct a mixed-use project satisfied the public use requirement where the project was projected to produce jobs, tax revenue, and economic revitalization. The court also said that in deciding whether a proposed use of the eminent domain power is for a public use, courts should be highly deferential to the policymakers who are making the decision about whether to use the eminent domain power. The court said the use of the eminent domain power is essentially a socioeconomic decision, and the court should not be involved in second-guessing elected officials on what would be good socioeconomic policy. Now, of course, there was extreme criticism that resulted from this decision, which is why it was all over the news for a period of time in 2005. Because what people were saying, which makes a good deal of sense, is if public use means anything the government thinks will be helpful, then there really is no limitation to the eminent domain power, right? Because the government can always say something will be beneficial. All right, so that's a little bit of the background. Now, in order to understand why this is potentially a problem, we have to think a little bit about what is the purpose. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Justice O'Connor dissented from the majority decision in Kelo and made the point that the effect of this ruling was essentially to remove the public use requirement from the Constitution. Because, she said, nearly any lawful use of real private property can be said to generate some incidental benefit to the public. And therefore, there's really no limit to what the eminent domain power can be used for. And so the public use requirement is essentially written out of the Constitution. She argued also that the majority's decision would likely benefit politically powerful interests at the expense of the less powerful. So, why do we have a public use requirement at all? I'll go through this pretty quickly so that you see why we even care about this. Why shouldn't the government be free to take for any purpose as long as it pays just compensation? Or put another way, why should a property owner object to condemnation if he or she is receiving just compensation? Well, there's a few reasons. One is eminent domain is inherently coercive. We're basically kicking people off their land against their will. And that's something that a government shouldn't be easily able to do in a free society. Also, the compensation that people receive is typically often under compensatory. Just compensation, as defined by the Constitution, is fair market value, or I should say as determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, fair market value. That is what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller in a free market transaction. The problem there is, by definition, if someone still owns his or her land, it is probably worth more than fair market value to him or her, or he would have already sold it, right? Anything you own that you have chosen to continue to own is worth more to you than what you could sell it for. Otherwise, you would have sold it. All right, so also, fair market value does not include subjective value. Things like what the property is subjectively worth to the current owners. Sentimental value, unique suitability of the property to the owner's needs, relocation costs, and the economic and non-economic costs of having to start over in a new location. There's no compensation for any of that. Another reason for the public use requirement is, in theory, it inhibits politically powerful groups or individuals from capturing the political process to enrich themselves. And therein lies a problem with the modern or broad view of public use. Okay. So, in Kelo, much criticism arose. Justice Stevens wrote the majority. He said, there are certain polar propositions that we have to consider here. One is, it is definitely not permitted for the government to take land from A for the sole purpose of transferring it to B, even if just compensation is paid. But on the other hand, a state may transfer from one private party to another if future use by the public is the purpose of the taking. So the problem is, how do we know if the government really is taking land because it thinks it will produce an economic benefit, or how do we know when the government is using that economic argument as a pretext to benefit influential private parties? That's the problem, right? Because it can also look like, it can often look like the project is intended to help the public, but really what's going on is someone has hijacked or co-opted the political process and is using it for its own benefit. Yes, I know, I'm almost done. Justice Stevens said, well, the reason we're not concerned about it here in New London is because there was an integrated development plan. Lots of inputs, a lot of public hearings. The plan was created publicly over a long period of time, and that suggested to some people that an integrated development plan could be a safe harbor. He pointed out a government's pursuit of a public purpose will often benefit individual private parties. But he said here the city has carefully formulated an economic development plan. He also said, given the comprehensive character of the plan, the thorough deliberation that preceded its adoption, we're not concerned about private favoritism. Now the key part of this is Justice Kennedy's concurrence. He provided the fifth vote in a 5-4 decision. And I think he is onto something here. He said a taking for an economic development project is presumptively valid, but, he said, a more stringent standard of review might be appropriate for a more narrowly defined category of takings. And said, further, where there is a plausible argument that the purpose of a taking is to favor a private party with only individual or pretextual public benefits, the court should look very closely at the taking and not be deferential. And I think this is part of the solution to the problem. Unfortunately, I don't have a complete solution to the problem. I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts when we get to the questions section, because it's very difficult to find a way to allow the government to safely and relatively freely use eminent domain for important projects, but police the government so that it's not abusing the power in order to favor politically powerful people. It should also be pointed out, many of you may know, after Kelo, many states enacted laws purporting to limit the eminent domain power, but many of those laws are toothless. So there really is need for a better method of judicial review. Okay, thank you.
I'm efficient at the technology. So hi, I'm Molly Brady. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. And I, again, as Professor Cohen did, just have to thank the center for having me here. It's really been such a terrifically warm welcome to a state I had never been to before. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of my time, including our discussion today. So I think I'm going to take my 15 minutes today to expose you a little bit to what I study, which is the history of takings doctrine. And I have three main objectives today. So first I want to tell you a little bit about what the Takings Clause is, where it came from, its cultural importance. Then I want to explain the trajectory of the Takings Clause over time. And then finally I want to tee up for you some new puzzles, I think, for the future of takings. So some things to keep your eye on if you are interested in this stuff. We've already seen the massive wall of text that is the Fifth Amendment there with the Takings Clause at the bottom. One thing I just want to point out, conventionally most scholars and a majority of justices on the Supreme Court view the Takings Clause as having four parts. So you need first to know that the subject of the challenged action is property. Second, you look at whether it's been taken. Third, you look at whether it's for public use, as Professor Cohen just told us all about. And finally, you determine what level of just compensation is owed. Eminent domain, of course, and the Takings Clause are culturally salient provisions. I always like to point that out. Here are just a smattering of some of the political cartoons in the last few years involving eminent domain depicting the government or public good as a wrecking ball or as a steamroller over the individual private owner. Of course, the movie Up is all about eminent domain to me when I see it, right? The holdout, the single house resisting looming development and potentially an exercise of the eminent domain power. But there's also another great example of cultural salience of eminent domain that I want to point out to you if you haven't seen it. And I don't have the screenshot that I wanted to show you up, and I won't show this now. But there was a terrific advertisement in the 2016 presidential campaign, my #1 political ad of all time. It depicted a bunch of children, that was by Ted Cruz, whacking a dollhouse with action figures of President Trump with sort of figures, dolls, and screaming, eminent domain, eminent domain, eminent domain, over and over again, followed by worried parents looking on and going, are these the values we want to teach our children? Which I just think is a beautiful example of how culturally relevant and salient eminent domain is. So we know it's culturally important, but it might surprise you to know that we actually know very little about its history from the founding era. So there's no record of debate surrounding the Takings Clause. There's no sort of impassioned defenses or critiques of it in contemporary sources. Instead, the most robust source of evidence we have about it is actually something unexpected, which are Colonial Highway Acts. Bet you didn't think I'd put this slide up. So these are actually prescribed procedures for laying out roadways, who would do it, who would get paid, when. This one I'm showing you here is actually from Connecticut in 1702. And here you can see really the predecessor to the Takings Clause, which says, if any person be damnified in his propriety or improved grounds, the town shall make him reasonable satisfaction. And so it's quite amazing to me whenever I look at these things in this history that from these statutes prescribing the procedures for laying out early colonial roads, we get the Takings Clause, this powerful and culturally salient image. For a long time, so nearly a century, the Takings Clause was mostly applied to actual appropriations, so government takings for things like roads and schoolhouses, parks, forts, that kind of stuff. But soon, new technologies and new government activity started raising new questions about what sorts of government actions would require compensation, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about one that I've studied. So beginning in the mid-19th century, it became advantageous for cities in particular to devote energy to leveling their streets, or grading their streets, so raising and lowering them, flattening hills, raising valleys, to level the road to less steep inclines. Why were they doing this? Well, there were a lot of reasons, nearly as many reasons as there were cities. One was that you could save a lot of money on transportation. So this beautifully visual graph shows you the power required on different sort of steepnesses of streets. And this would apply to both horse-drawn transportation and railroads. It's more expensive the steeper the hill, so they actually invested money in flattening roads. There were other motivations too. Chicago is a famous example. You may not know this, but most of the loop in Chicago, if you've ever visited, was actually raised somewhere between 4 and 14 feet over a period of 20 years. To do that was a pretty amazing feat of engineering. They would literally put jacks under the buildings and raise them a little bit each day and then fill in with dirt underneath. And that was because Chicago had a massive problem with drainage. So Chicago was constantly wet and unhealthy and flooded. So that's one reason why they were doing this sort of filling in of valleys, leveling of streets. There were also some less admirable goals, certainly in hindsight. Grading the streets made it hard for less desirable people to stay put. So because of difficulty of access, often land on hills was cheaper in cities. And so in many areas, that's where new immigrants moved. That's where tenements sprung up. And so one way to get rid of a slum without using the eminent domain power was just to level the streets and make it really hard for people to get in and out. So that was another reason this was happening. So why did street grading present a crisis for property law, and also for the law of takings in particular? Well, grading often drastically affected or devalued property, but it did not physically take or appropriate any part of it. And I will now show you some pictures that illustrate this problem. So this comes from Seattle. This house used to be at street level. All that drop-off happened after they dug out the street. So that person's front door used to be out to the street. Now suddenly tens of feet below is where the street would be. So this seriously impacts use and enjoyment, but actually doesn't physically take or appropriate anything. Here's an example from a more urban place. This is from Pittsburgh. The Keystone Loan Office had the bright idea to get out of town when that started happening. Here is an example of a buried house from Chicago. So as I said, Chicago was raised in some cases 14 feet. Sometimes they would just bury the first story, didn't physically take or occupy any part of it, but just made it impossible for you to get in. So now your window is the door, which I quite like. And here's an example, or there's another example I want to show you real quick, which is from San Francisco. So this is a really famous grading incident, the 2nd Street regrade. If you look up in the top right corner of this picture, you'll see kind of a hill sloping off into the distance. Again, to cheapen the cost of transportation, they decided to cut it down. There you can see a bridge across what was formerly across the street neighbors, and here's a close-up view of some of the devastation that happened in this area. Again, nothing physically taken. These people's use and enjoyment is seriously affected, though. There was a lot of dissatisfaction because in the early years, state and federal courts found that these were not government actions requiring any compensation. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, as I mentioned, because people thought this was pretty unfair, that individuals were affected by these government actions but wouldn't get payment for having lost value and sometimes their ability to use land. Another famous example came from Pittsburgh, in which the Roman Catholic diocese had actually constructed a cathedral in the city. And then a few years later, they cut down the street in front of it about 17 to 30 feet. Even assuming this would have been net beneficial, the losses that would result from having to move this brand new cathedral were quite astronomical, but the court in Pennsylvania found no taking following majority rule. Judges urged state and local legislators to act to correct the injustice, provide payment. They did not. And as for the cathedral, just as it was slated for demolition, it actually ended up burning to the ground. I like to imagine this artist sketching as like the fire is burning in the distance. So as I mentioned, one of the recurring themes in these rulings was that the street grading didn't physically take any property. But eventually state courts came to find another way of requiring compensation when it was unjustly denied. So they actually invented a new form of property right, which is the right to access your property. And that became the property that was taken by these regrading actions. So this is one of the first expansions that I've found in studying this in Takings Doctrine. So we have a move from requiring compensation for appropriation of land to actually compensating for destructions of kind of invisible rights, the right to access your property. Not long after these regrading controversies, Takings Doctrine underwent another expansion. And this is a 1922 case that is quite famous to all property professors and many law school students, which is the case of Pennsylvania Coal v. Mann. This slide depicts coal mining technology circa 1920. So this is called coal pillar mining. So basically what they would do is they would go in, dig out a bunch of coal, but leave in pillars so that they could keep moving farther and farther in without the surface collapsing on them. And this is the technology that this case was about. So the Pennsylvania Coal Company had sold its surface rights to the property to landowners, to people building houses, but they had reserved for themselves the right to mine beneath. In other words, they had reserved not just the actual coal between the pillars, but also the pillars themselves. They had reserved the right to mine all the coal. So under a charitable reading of that conveyance, the plaintiff, the Pennsylvania Coal Company, had actually retained the right to cause people's houses to collapse through its mining. In 1921, though, the state of Pennsylvania passes an act, the point of which is to prevent coal companies from doing this, to prevent this common occurrence of subsidence or causing these cave-ins, which was constantly in the news. So this is a picture of the Scranton Times talking about pillar robbing, or the process of actually removing those pillars at the end of a coal mining project, causing cave-ins, houses falling in the center picture. In the middle of streets, you have a tree there on the right. And the Penn Coal Company was worried because they thought the Kohler Act actually wiped out these rights that they had bargained for, these rights to mine all the coal. And so they challenged this as a taking, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. So this case actually forever changes the import and reach of the takings clause, because the court says that if a regulation goes too far, it will be recognized as a taking. So now we have the takings clause extended again to a new range of activity, not just appropriation, not just destruction of some invisible property right, but also regulation. So most of the court's trouble in takings doctrine since that time, since 1922, has been figuring out what a regulation going too far actually means. So it can't be the case that every regulation affecting property use, for example, noise regulation, would require compensation. But there are regulations that do seriously impinge on development and use, or functionally condemn property, and do seem to require compensation. Why draw a line that would prevent it if it functionally condemns? That question of when a regulation goes too far is what employs thousands of law professors across the country, yours truly included. It's a question of what a regulatory taking is. And it's no doubt an issue that continues to be important, and we can definitely talk about it in Q&A. But I'd instead like to close by telling you about some other places to watch, I think, for the next interesting shifts in takings doctrine. So you may have noticed that many of the examples I've talked about are railways, roadways, examples of transit, right? And transit is likely to continue to cause problems. So here are two examples of transit that I think will cause problems. One is high-speed rail, and the other is the Hyperloop, or what I call the ATM for people, like vacuum tubing of these sort of pods of transport that will make it really fast to travel across the country. What's interesting to me about these, they seem to be, of course, routine appropriations of land for a transit use, maybe not a controversial public use. But what I think will be interesting here is seeing what we do about the compensation question. So one thing that happened in the railroad era, mentioned at the beginning, are different pieces of the takings clause. In the just compensation piece, the question of how much people should be compensated when a railroad came to town is actually quite controversial. So there was this rule called the benefit offset rule, which said that actually you could reduce the amount of compensation you would pay by how benefited the property was. And so typically how it would go is that a judge would say railroads are bringing growth, railroads are enhancing property values in the area, so we don't owe you the compensation for your property that we otherwise would. Even though they're causing other issues and appropriating property, we can actually deduct the benefits from your compensation award. This made it really cheap to extend rail across the country, with obviously great social benefits. But the question is whether that benefit offset rule is going to similarly make it cheap to extend these types of transportation methods through the country, particularly because they may affect different types of people. So if you're someone in New Jersey, and the Hyperloop only stops in Philadelphia and New York, how is it helping you or increasing your property value to have it run through? I think these will be interesting questions as these technologies proliferate. Pipelines, too, present another new problem. So pipelines here, I'm thinking of the ones used to transport natural gas for storage and consumption. Again, looks sort of like garden variety, maybe, appropriation of property for something publicly beneficial, potentially. But what if all the gas is headed overseas? Or won't actually benefit the consumers in the states where these pipelines are located. So these challenges are cropping up all over my home state of Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. The procedures the federal government actually uses to authorize the use of eminent domain for pipelines, they're claiming they're constitutionally infirm because they do not scrutinize who will benefit from the pipelines. Is it really a public use if it's for the benefit of another country's public? There are scores more questions that are cropping up and that will continue to crop up. So should you have any claims to business losses as part of your just compensation if your business depends on a particular type of land or profit from it? In light of the increasing importance of alternative forms of energy, should we maybe start considering solar rights as a form of property that will require compensation if harmed or destroyed by the government. If the government invents a new form of currency, and I'm not joking here, to compensate you, so some form of imaginary credits rather than payments of cash to you when they take your property, does that satisfy its constitutional obligation to compensate you? These are some of the big and fascinating cases that are just starting to be litigated in state and lower federal courts, and I think are on their way to higher places. So I hope this brief overview has indicated to you what I think is important about the Takings Clause. It's an enormous government power affecting one of our most significant rights, the right of property. I hope I've given you a sense of its trajectory over time and some of the points where I expect its next chapters to be written. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
I've determined to take a little different approach. I'm not going to use my PowerPoint, but I have it, and it has the material in detail for you, the quotes and so forth. If anybody wants it, just send me a note at rodney.smith@uvu.edu. I'll be happy to send it to you. I want to begin by thanking Michael. I really appreciate that you didn't say anything personal about me. That was very kind and thoughtful of you. I want to thank, I think the way that we've set this up has been just right again. I think Chuck began by talking about the specifics of issues, and Molly went from the history and then brought it up to a current sense of not just what is happening, but what may yet happen. I'm going to go back in time again, and I'm going to go back to this person. This is James Madison. And I'm largely going to talk about the taking that he considered to be most significant. And that's the First Amendment. And to read the First Amendment as a takings provision based on Madison's writing. But I need to tell you a little bit about Madison. Some historians will say he is was 5'6" and actually weighed substantially more than 100 pounds. But the truth is, that meant he was in his shoes, because without his shoes, he was about 5'4". He was thin. He did weigh just in the range of 100 pounds. You see him in that suit. That's how he always dressed. That black suit, the white shirt, doesn't show his pants. He would he would have knickers, and then he would have white stockings. The only time he deviated in public was when he married Dolly, one of the great romances in American history. Then he had a ruffled white shirt. But otherwise, that's how Madison looked. He spoke with a whisper. It became a tool for him later as people would strain to hear what he said. And yet, even though he spoke with this whisper, it was said of Madison that he was always the most persuasive or eloquent in any group of which he was a part. Jefferson said, if eloquence is the capacity to persuade, then Madison is the most eloquent of all. He was, his capacity for argumentation was such that Patrick Henry, his nemesis in many matters, including his getting elected and being able to attend the first Congress, did everything in his power to keep Madison from being able to participate in the first Congress, where the Bill of Rights is adopted. Madison is influenced greatly by the Enlightenment. in particular the Scottish Enlightenment. He's influenced, but before we get to that, he is influenced by Locke and Locke's sense of property that, as Locke would put it, let me get to where I would have that so I get the quote just right. I'm going to do what I do in class. There. He said, though the earth and inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. That there was this property in a person. And that's the way Madison looked at it. He later, in William Penn, who was a friend of Locke's, they both tried to bail the other out of prison or imprisonment on more than one occasion. Penn essentially said property, like Locke, is tied to person. But he added the natural rights dimension, which was property itself comes from God, who is the author of property, author of that sort of personhood. And that he viewed limitations of conscience as being inappropriate because you were taking from a person that allegiance they had to God, their duty to God. So they were influential. But the most influential, and he was generally considered to be the most influential teacher in American history because of the people he influenced. Presidents, secretaries of state, vice presidents, members of the Supreme Court, John Witherspoon. And John Witherspoon taught, and this I think has been some of the theme of the entire conference, that if you take, this is his words, therefore, he said, if therefore we yield up our temporal property, we at the same time deliver the conscience into bondage. He saw a connection between property, real property of the kind the other speakers have spoken, and a higher level of property. Madison, and so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you it, my conclusion, then I'll make the case for it, and then I'll end. What Madison said, essentially, is the First Amendment is all about conscience. Today, theorists will say it's about political speech or it's about something else, but for him, it was all about conscience and this notion of personhood. We'll talk about the religion clauses last. In the First Amendment, he talks about not abridging this sort of expressive right, this sense of opinion, because he saw the opinions and our expression, whether we use the press or another medium, as being an extension of ourselves. It was not instrumental. You were not protecting a process. You were protecting an end. The capacity of that individual to fairly share their conscience. And John Adams said of Madison that Madison was the finest of the first four presidents, the best of the first four presidents. And that's striking because they were in different political parties. But he said that because Madison maintained allegiance to this sense of expression, permitting the Tories, who continued to live in the United States, those who favored Britain in the War of 1812, even at the point at which they are invading and burning the city of Washington, he still protected their right to speak, viewing it as if he didn't, he would be taking away a part of who they were. That was inappropriate for him. And then he said, the most sacred of all property is conscience. Religious conscience. Why? it's not just an expression of an opinion. It's not just an expression of a belief. It is a connection with God. And so, he would put together the continuum of regulation would run something like this for him. And I'll start with the Fifth Amendment. Property, real property, or as Locke would say, that which we produce, the land, how we use it, how we become productive, that's a sense of the person. And so for him, I think, Chuck, you're right, it would be public purpose. This public use would be a public purpose. And for him, that was a standard of some rigor. You couldn't take property without a public purpose. And if you did, you had to offer not just fair compensation, just compensation. Because you could, if it was really necessary for a public purpose, take that part of a person's personhood, that extension of it, you could take it, but you had to provide compensation. The thing is, at some level, property is more, real property is more compensable. You can compensate for it. You take somebody's opinion, you take their opinion, and you're taking a part of themselves it's very hard to compensate for. So he required, government would have to have a very compelling sort of interest to take that kind of property, much like the test that's used today. But he would also provide more a sense of equality. Government couldn't provide means of favoring one expression over another. And then finally, that which was beyond the touch of government was religious conscience. Now, the quid pro quo for being beyond, and what made it different than other opinions, it couldn't buy in the political marketplace in the same way. It had an establishment clause. It was limited. Government could show no preference for any particular religion. They were limited. That was a limitation that helped facilitate exempting religious conscience from the touch of government. In December 15, 1791, Virginia becomes the 10th of 14 states to ratify the Bill of Rights. We now have, and only a matter of less than 4 months later, he offers this essay on property. Let me just read some parts of that which support what I have been arguing. He said, property is one, a man's land or merchandise or money is called his property. We've talked about that. 2, a man has property in his opinions and the free communications of them. We talked about that. And 3, he has a property of peculiar value in his religious opinions and in the profession, not just the profession, but the profession and practice of them. That duty that one owes his or her God is something that often requires action. He concludes by saying, in a word, man is said to have a right to his property. He may be equally said to have a property in his rights. He then adds, conscience is the most sacred of all property, other property depending in part on positive law. We talked about positive law, but this was, the right to conscience was a natural law, like Penn said, a law between God and man, a gift of God to man, a duty of man to God that was well beyond the touch of government. So conscience is the most sacred of all property, other property depending in part on positive law, the exercise of that being a natural and unalienable right. Then he goes on to provide there are no direct or indirect takings. So he talked in that essay about direct and indirect takings, both in the real property context and in the context of conscience. As to conscience, he said government should be repelled from engagement with religious conscience. Then the best expression of what Madison believed, because he held to this throughout all of his life, was an argument that he had in offering an amendment. He was too junior to even offer it to he was at the Virginia Constitutional Convention. He wanted to offer this amendment. Actually, Patrick Henry helps facilitate his offering it, probably ruse the day. But Madison offers this following amendment in which he declares what he means about the right of conscience. He said, that religion or duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it being under the direction of reason and conviction only. That it's solely between a person and God, the Creator. He said, all men are entitled to the full and free exercise of it. So this free exercise language of the First Amendment appears here. And so he wants to make it clear that it's not just free exercise, it's the full and free exercise. Then he goes on and sets forth an establishment clause that provides there may be no particular emoluments or privileges given to religion by government, nor any penalties or disabilities. He likes to use that kind of parallelism. So on the one hand, no emoluments, no special privileges. On the other hand, no penalties, no disabilities. When, he goes on to say, when may the state limit the right of conscience? He said, when it's the equal liberty of another, meaning the equal right of conscience of another, or when the exercise of the state shall be manifestly endangered. That's the standard he has for that. It's a compelling interest sort of standard for expression, but for religious exercise, it is the state may only intervene in the interest of equal liberty, or if the state's interest is manifestly endangered. In other words, he recognized without a state, Joseph talked some about this morning, without a state, without a government, we'd have anarchy, and with anarchy, our rights would be limited. So if the state could establish that in fact its existence was manifestly endangered, then it could impact this right, and only then. Well, the Fifth Amendment talks about property. That I could argue the Second Amendment's about property. I probably have said enough, and I will again indicate. Property, real property, merchandise is the most susceptible to regulation. Then you have expression, and finally on the continuum, the furthest from the reach of government is conscience. I think I think that James Madison would be more vexed today even than he was in his day. And what he said he was most vexed about was the limitation of the right of conscience. I think what he'd be vexed about today is that people have ceased to understand that if you take from an individual their religious conscience, you've deprived them of something that can't be compensated for, and you have reached beyond what is required or expected in any just government. I want to see a world where we have a First Amendment that's understood as an end, as property, whether it be in expression or in conscience. Thank you.
I'm going to follow Rodney's lead in giving the panelists an opportunity to make a comment in response to all three presentations before we throw it open. Okay. Well, since I'm moderating, I'm going to indulge myself the fact that I'm a moderator and ask my own question. I'm from Chicago, actually, and so I've actually seen the street grades, the physical evidence of it in many neighborhoods in which you could see actually the stairs in many homes going down 5-6 feet and you can see the 19th century grade in these front yards, but they're actually subterranean. And this is especially prominent in Mexican-American neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen. And that neighborhood is actually, in recent years, has undergone a lot of gentrification. My alma mater, the University of Illinois Chicago, which is a state university, has been partly responsible for the process of gentrification in the area. And it's done through a partnership of public-private interests with private developers, the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. And the city of Chicago actually uses the mayor's office, and this has nothing to do with takings, I assume, but they have this device called TIFs, tax incremental financing, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in which they use taxes that would be earmarked for public services in Chicago. They go into what could be charitably called a slush fund for the mayor, and then it's diverted to private developers. And then the private developers are allotted that money to build in neighborhoods that are low income, working class, and they build these developments. And of course, this facilitates the process of gentrification. Because of that, I'm just curious, the question on both, this is actually a question for both Chuck and Molly, is the doctrine of takings and the controversies and questions that surround public benefit. Does that play a role in gentrification at all? And if so, how? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think so many. So I think the question of what is being replaced often raises questions of gentrification. You know, certainly it's often eminent domain in the era of urban renewal was used to sort of trash urban working class neighborhoods and then put in something that would be better, whether it would be mixed uses, you know, things that would ostensibly bring jobs, maybe never did. The aftermath of Kilo is, of course, very interesting in that regard. Now it's kind of overrun by feral cats as opposed to being a Pfizer compound. But I think that looms very large here because the sort of state has an incentive to increase its tax revenue by putting in things that will eventually yield more property tax revenue to itself. And so getting rid of some of these lower to middle class neighborhoods is often part of the game in order to do that. So it's always present. I think gentrification underlies a lot of the redevelopment projects that now after Kilo are public uses.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The historically, the biggest uses of eminent domain was for blight removal. So they would go into big cities that had lots of low-income people, often people of color, and basically wipe out the neighborhood, take the neighborhood by eminent domain, and all of those people would be dispersed. The people that used to live there would be dispersed, and it would be gentrified. Lincoln Center in New York City used to be low-income, I believe it was a low-income African-American neighborhood. So, yeah, go ahead.
No.
Well, so gentrification is not just a factor, it's often the purpose behind these projects.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. The thing I wanted to add in a Madisonian sense to this, and it goes back to your remarks early on, Chuck, is that some of the subjective and other, if you begin with, is it just, is it you are able to ask a series, and should ask, a series of questions that you might not ask if you're only focused on how much do we compensate them for this monetarily. It requires that you deal with those issues.
Right, and the problem is this, there's a lot of Supreme Court case law that says just compensation is fair market value, which does not incorporate any of those things that you're talking about. Because a person who comes to you to buy your house is not going to be willing to pay more to you because of the special meaning it has in terms of your conscience, or if you're talking about something other than a house, it's just not going to be a factor.
Okay, so I think we're going to throw it open. I'll start with you.
Just one of the suggestions there was, or at least the question was, is maybe improvement over what's going on. I wondered if possibly on these same things, for instance, the case of Kilo, I heard you mention that it's now a place for alley cats. Could there be incorporated within that just compensation, if it's taken for private as well as public use, some type of clause within it that says if this fails, then there can be an additional compensation to those who were forced to give up their property for, quote, public use, but that was misjudged. So that there's some type of grandfather clause or something within it that would allow that if the city doesn't do it accurately, or if it becomes totally private use, and therefore not sufficient benefit of the public to justify the taking of property, could there be something within that, or maybe there is, I don't know.
There are some statutes that provide if the project is not built within a certain amount of time, the people who lost their land through eminent domain can buy it back, but they don't get it for free, but they could get it back. So there's something like that, but not quite to the extent of what you're talking about.
Yeah. A couple of the constitutional provisions also say that if they take more than they end up using or something like that, then they have procedures for returning it. But it's not very many of them, and it certainly doesn't provide for damages. That's a very interesting idea.
I think this is mostly for Dr. Cohen. I'm curious what you think of the Hawaii Housing Authority versus Midkiff case for a couple reasons. One, that's a case where, if my memory serves correctly, Justice O'Connor was with the majority.
She wrote the opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
So she's against Kalo. The other thing that's fascinating for me about that case, and I mean, my politics are basically conservative, but I do have my democratic socialist moments. And what the Hawaii Authority was trying to do was to rectify this problem of kind of deep land ownership inequality. And so it was a very broad public use, public purpose. I noticed that you have an article recommending against any kind of takings for
economic development.
For economic development.
Yeah.
I wonder if that would fall under your understanding of that.
I don't see what happened in Midkiff as being for economic development. The purpose of the Midkiff, the law at issue in Midkiff was to redistribute ownership more broadly among Hawaii residents. Economic development for me is more of a situation where some government entity comes in and takes a bunch of land and builds or plans to build a project because it will produce tax revenue, more jobs, beautification, revitalization. And a lot of the reason I'm against those projects is so many of them never happen. In other words, they take the land, but the project is not completed. Or the project is completed, but it doesn't produce the benefits that were promised. So I don't see it as quite the same as Hawaii Housing Authority v. Midkiff.
So you think Hawaii was decided correctly?
Oh, I think it was decided correctly in view of the, yes, I do, in view of the law existed at the time, because the theory there was that the public benefit was the removal of the oligarchy or oligopoly.
Yeah.
That was the harm. So it didn't really matter if the land then later produced other benefits, because the removal of the oligopoly was the benefit. The other irony is of that is O'Connor wrote the majority opinion in that case, and she used very broad language. She said at one point, the eminent domain power is coextensive with the police power, meaning anything the government chooses to do that is within its power, it may use the eminent domain power for. But in Kelo, in her dissent, she basically acknowledged that that was a mistake and backed off of it.
I think she also, when I talk about this, she also seems to have come around on the idea of harm prevention, which is
Right.
always playing a big role. You know, how we fit in the fact that we recognize and want government to be involved in regulating nuisances, so affirmatively harmful land uses.
Right.
And so this question of how we actually should incorporate the question of the government's purpose, so if it's, and sort of what it's removing. So I think she distinguishes and says, you know, there was obviously blight. Now, of course, blight subject to manipulation, what actually counts as blight, but there was obviously blight or problematic harm in Hawaii Housing Authority, and there is not such a harm or demonstration of harm in the neighborhood that was raised in Kelo. And so I think that's, she may have come around on that later, but I think that's one of the
Yes.
ways to explain the inconsistency.
Henry?
Yes.
My question is a historical one, and it was prompted by Molly's comment that the takings clause is culturally resonant for us Americans. And the question that I have is, how far is it culturally resonant for us Americans, and how far is this a matter of English cultural resonance? And I'll just explain my question in two ways. So Molly mentioned the importance of infrastructure and transportation sorts of projects in the early history of the takings clause, and that reminded me that the second most common occasion for parliamentary statute in 18th century England after the Enclosure Acts was transportation acts. That is to say, turnpikes, canals, things of that sort. And that in turn reminded me that that the English have had a love affair with their private property for a long time, and I thought it might be useful just to read Article 39 of the Magna Carta, which goes back to 1215. Perhaps this very center marked the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, as we certainly did. Article 39 reads, "No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned or disseised," I assume that means separated from his property, "or exiled or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him nor send upon him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land." So I guess my question is an historical one. I don't know whether any of you really know this, but it's when Madison and Company were developing the takings clause, how far were they drawing on English experience, and how far did they imagine that they were doing something that was distinctively American?
So I can talk a little about that. So Article 39 is viewed as sort of the ancestor of both due process and the takings clause, both the due process clause and the takings clause. And I think one of the tricky things is disentangling due process, which is sort of an infirmity on the state. So they can't do something that violates due process even with compensation necessarily. From takings, which permits the act but requires compensation. One thing that's interesting with respect to the highway acts that I mentioned is actually those only applied to the American colonies. So in England, there were no such companion acts, and people have wondered about why those sort of compensation procedures were required for American roadways, but not necessarily always for British roadways. Some have suggested it's something about social cohesion. In a time in which property is precarious, we want to encourage people to sort of give up their property and make it better for them, and so the compensation requirement was put in for that reason. I don't know enough. I'm working now on actually empirically studying whether compensation was given even when it wasn't required. In other words, whether the law of the land was interpreted to require compensation before sort of the articulation of the takings clause. But I think that's sort of an open question for historians.
Was it also true in the colonies? There were some colonies where the colonies could take without compensation.
Right. It tends to be improved land versus unimproved land. So if there was improvements on the property, you would have to compensate in most of the colonies, and then unimproved land, maybe not so.
Others?
Yo. So I don't know a lot about the subject because it's not very in-depth in my knowledge of these things, but is there a way of fighting that? Because the public always tries to fight back, signing petitions, doing stuff to get it, but how it's written, it looks like as long as it's for the public use and everyone has their compensation for it, what they deem as fair. I know in criminal cases sometimes courts change their ruling because of fear of public violence, because of rioting. Is there any way like the public fighting that, even if they all sign the petition, it looks like they could never win?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that they can show what they feel and get the ruling changed?
Yeah, I mean, part of the justification given for Justice Stevens and other justices' attitude, which is basically, we'll let the government officials do whatever they want, is the idea that the public will rise up and remove the government officials if they abuse the eminent domain power. So it's shifting the decision of the political process away from the legal process. It's arguable how effective that really is as a method of controlling the eminent domain power, because government officials typically will target politically disenfranchised communities. If they're going to build a highway, they're not going to build it through the most expensive neighborhood in town, because they don't want to pay what it costs, but also probably in the back of their mind, the people in the poor neighborhood are not as politically able to protect themselves. So in theory, yes, there is a way to fight back.
I'll take a stab at responding to both of the questions. I think part of it is, I think there is something American about this period, about the time when we need to remember that the Constitution was ratified and the Bill of Rights was ratified in what we might call a revolutionary moment in our history. And I think part of the response is, I think when you start thinking about property as being something more than, as being personhood in some way, that I think strengthens the argument. It's something you would raise before. You're not just taking. And that government, the way to do this is to have government, I've been a city attorney, have government act responsibly. They do not have to take. They ought to hear these arguments, and I think they can be couched in a very personal kind of way, and often are in that context. And that will help us make sure that the taking is not just compensated for, but is just. And the final thing I would say is, one of the things that we've lost since the framing era is a sense that every branch of government has some particular responsibility for interpreting the Constitution. And if I were sitting on a city council, I would take the more robust property view of a Madison and believe that that was my constitutional obligation to protect people in that way.
Joseph?
That question actually leads kind of into my question. So talking about sort of political resistance to the abuse of eminent domain, Chuck, you mentioned briefly that there was a huge state response to Kilo. 20-some states, I think, legislatures
40.
passed laws.
Yeah, it was 40.
Oh, 40, okay.
Yeah.
So most of the states passed laws saying we don't want to do what they did at Kilo here.
Right.
Then you quickly said, well, those laws don't have any teeth, so it hasn't really been effective. I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about that. How could those laws have been
It's
given?
not so much that they don't have any teeth, but they have a lot of loopholes. So some states passed laws that said takings for economic development are forbidden. So what was done in Kilo would be forbidden. Others passed other restrictions, but one of the grounds for use of eminent domain that is still permitted is to remove land that is to take land that is considered to be blighted. And the definitions of blight in many of those statutes are so broad that any land could be considered blighted, including a very nice middle-class neighborhood with, nicely maintained lawns and, not the type of area that you envision when you think of blight. So there is I would say there's some better protection, but not complete protection.
I think one of the things that and the students in particular need to understand this is that state and local and other governments may provide more protection than the United States Constitution. They just can't provide less.
Right.
And that's as true of the takings clause as it is of anything. And so I think it is, going back to the prior panel, learning and teaching and then engaging in the process. And I can't overemphasize the importance of being involved in things as simple as committees and public safety, Madison's first public office, to serve in these kinds of capacities and to realize that you have constitutional responsibility as you do so.
And as the non-attorney historian, I'm the only one I think in the room, I was just going to circle back to Fred's question about, Henry's question about the British imperial context, because that actually dovetails with what Rodney's framing of, which I thought was a really unique take about thinking about liberty of conscience as a taking. And of course that whole discourse of liberty of conscience and protecting the right of religious dissenters is rooted in British common law culture, early modern British political culture. You can think of the era of Cromwell, in which the state church was in effect dissolved, and so you had all these sectarian religious groups that were quite radical. And then of course after the restoration of the monarchy, there was a passage of all sorts of legislation by Anglicans and Presbyterians who were angry at all these sectarian, Baptists, Quakers, and groups that we don't even hear of anymore because they were crushed. And there was a reaction again in the late 17th century, of course, I'm sure you know, there was a reaction against that legislative repression of the so-called Cavalier Codes. And that whole language of liberty of conscience, which comes out of William Penn himself, as a Quaker, was involved in litigating his rights, the rights of Quakers. And so the founding fathers, are 18th century British Atlantic imperial subjects as much as they are Americans, because the United States was an invention in the 18th century, right? So they're drawing from those precedents and that language of the rights of religious dissenters and protecting of liberty of conscience. And it's curious, in the French case, it's a lot different, I suppose, of the French Empire, the role after, the treatment of Huguenots after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, right? And so there's just and then the sort of 18th century sort of assertion of the Catholic state again, and crushing sort of religious dissent, because it's the legacy of the wars of the religion in the 16th century of like, what do you do with religious pluralism in France, and the problem of Protestants, and so the French state's reaction to that is much different, of course, and maybe that's one legacy that you see in the differences in the civil code in France. I don't know, but there's one difference that speaks to a British imperial context to Madison, perhaps.
I think if you go to John Witherspoon, beginning with Witherspoon and before that Robertson's influence on Madison and then his own families, they were very much, I think the Enlightenment had an enormous impact on them, and they felt that they were extending the Enlightenment. These were revolutionaries that did think they were doing more for liberty than had been done in the past.
Yeah. We have time for one last question. Okay, I'd like to, let's give the panelists a round of applause.
And we have, we'll be